Chapter 15. The Phoenicians. Phoenician traders. When the Israelites walked from Egypt back up to Canaan, they weren't moving into an empty country. They were already people living in Canaan. The people who lived up in the north of Canaan were called Phoenicians, and they were the greatest sailors in the ancient world. The northern part of Canaan wasn't a very good place to grow wheat because it was rocky and sandy and dry. It wasn't a good place to raise animals because there wasn't enough grass or water to make them fat and healthy. And it was hard to get into or out of if it was surrounded by steep, craggy hills. So the Phoenicians pushed their boats out onto the water and sailed around the Mediterranean Sea. They became traders. They cut down the tall cedar trees that grew in their homeland and floated the logs to other countries. They built beautiful furniture and sold it for a high price. They sold salt and dried fish and embroidered cloth. And they sailed around the coast of the Mediterranean and found the best places to dig up tin and other metals. The Phoenicians were famous for making glass. Ancient glassmaking was a long, complicated process. First, the Phoenicians made a special chemical called lye by pouring water over the ashes from a wood fire and collecting the liquid that oozed out. They mixed this lye with pure sand and melted the sand-lye mixture over a hot, hot fire. To get the fire hot enough to melt sand, slaves probably had to fan the fire with special pumps called bellows for hours and hours. Once they had melted the sand and lye together, the Phoenicians would pour the mixture into special molds. When the sand-lye mixture cooled, it was hard, shiny glass. Sometimes the Phoenicians colored the glass by putting red, blue, and yellow dyes into it, or wound colored threads around the mold so that the finished glass had a pattern of threads all through it. Sometimes the glass even had gold and jewels in it. Other ancient peoples made glass too, but the Phoenicians were the first glassmakers to invent glass blowing. Have you ever blown bubbles in your milk through a straw? That's exactly what the Phoenicians did with their hot liquid glass. Instead of pouring the glass into a mold, a Phoenician glassmaker would dip a hollow pipe made out of thin metal into the sticky, melted glass. Some of the glass would cling to the end of the pipe in the glob. Then the glassmaker would blow very gently through the pipe. The glass at the other end would puff out into a big round bubble. As long as the glass was still soft, the glassmaker could stretch it out so that the bubble was long and thin, or twisted into different shapes. Finally, the glassmaker would cool the glass and break it carefully off the pipe. Blown glass was the most beautiful and expensive kind of ancient glass. All around the Mediterranean Sea, people were happy to pay the Phoenicians for this blown glass. The Phoenicians were also known for making a beautiful purple dye out of snails. They collected snails called murex from the sea and boiled them with salt water and lemon juice for 10 days. The boiling snails smelled awful. As a matter of fact, Phoenician cities like Tyre were famous for their stench caused by the dye factories that were boiling snails. "You stink like a man from Tyre," was a favorite insult in ancient times. When the dye was finished, the Phoenicians dipped wool into it. The dye turned the wool a dark, beautiful purple. It took so many snails to make purple dye that the cloth made from purple wool was expensive. Sometimes it cost a whole year's pay to buy a purple cloak. So purple was often called the color of kings because only kings could afford to wear it. The founding of Carthage. The Phoenicians sailed all around the Mediterranean Sea, and they started colonies, little settlements of Phoenician people in many of the places where they landed. One of the most famous cities was Tyre, over in Canaan. Another was Carthage, all the way over in northern Africa. Carthage was first settled around 814 BC. At first, Carthage was just a tiny village, but soon it grew to be a huge, busy city where the merchants from all different countries came to trade their goods. We don't know the names of the first Phoenicians who settled in Carthage, but later a great writer named Virgil told his famous story about the beginnings of the city of Carthage. Dido was a Phoenician princess, the sister of the king of Tyre. She should have been happy. She was married to a very rich man, and she lived in a palace. But Dido's brother, the king, was jealous of her and of her husband's wealth. He wanted all that money for himself. So the king had Dido's husband arrested and put to death. Dido was terrified. Would she be next? She gathered together all her friends and left Tyre in the middle of the night. They pushed away from the shore in a boat and sailed away, never to return. Dido and her friends traveled and traveled. Finally, they spotted land. "Let's go ashore here and build a new city," Dido urged her friends. They agreed, but when they reached the place where Dido wanted to settle, they found that the land was already settled. "Should we go somewhere else?" Dido's friends said. But Dido was determined to build her own city on the very spot. She wanted to live close to the water so that the ships would visit her new city and trade with her. So she said to the owner of the land, "Will you sell me as much land as I can cover with the skin of a bull?" "Of course," the owner agreed. He thought that Dido would put her bull hide down over a little patch of ground just large enough to stand on. But instead, Dido got out a very sharp knife and cut her bull hide into hundreds of long, thin strips. She laid the strips out, end to end, around a huge portion of land. "There," she said, "now keep your promise and sell me this ground." The owner of the land was forced to agree, so Dido and her friends built a tower on the ground and named the tower Bull's Hide. They settled around the tower and named their city Carthage. Soon, ships from all over the world came to Carthage to buy and sell their goods. The city, bought with a bull's skin, became one of the most powerful in the world. Chapter 16. The Return of Assyria. Ashurbanipal's attack. Do you remember reading about Shamshi-Adad and the Assyrian king who wanted to rule the whole world? He led his armies out to conquer the cities all around him, and he built an empire, the Assyrian Empire. But when they fought the Babylonians, the Assyrians lost. They became part of Babylon's empire and had to obey the king of Babylon. But all the time they were thinking, one day we will be free and we will try to conquer the world again. Finally, the day came. The Assyrians rebelled against their masters, the Babylonians. They dug canals through the city of Babylon and flooded it with water, washing the city away. And then they started out to rebuild their empire. "We are like an evil rain that washes its enemies away," they boasted. "We are like a net that tangles the feet of those who fight against us." The Assyrians raged up and down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, taking over every city in their path. They stampeded over to Canaan and scattered the Israelites like dust. The Israelites were never allowed to return back to their own land again. They marched up into Asia Minor and forced the people there to obey them. And one of the greatest Assyrian kings of all, Ashurbanipal, led his soldiers all the way down to Egypt and took it over. Even the mighty pharaohs of Egypt had to obey Assyria. Ashurbanipal became king of Assyria around 668 BC. He terrified his enemies. For fun, he went on lion hunts, chasing the lions down on horseback and shooting arrows at them. And when he led his soldiers into battle, he fought like an angry lion himself. With Ashurbanipal leading them, the Assyrians were almost impossible to beat. Why were they so hard to conquer? The Assyrian soldiers fought in pairs. One man would hold a shield made out of baskets, tied together with leather. The other would shoot arrows from behind the shield. These basket shields were very light, but they kept arrows and spear points out. The Assyrians would put their basket shields side by side and march towards their enemies like a moving wall, with arrows spitting out from behind it. Soon, the only way to escape the invading Assyrians was to hide inside a city with strong brick or stone walls. But Ashurbanipal, the king who was as strong as a lion, knew how to get over the city walls. First, he ordered his soldiers to build a ramp out of dirt. They hauled buckets of earth up to the city's wall, holding their basket shields over their heads to protect themselves. They dumped the earth into a heap against the wall and went back for more. Slowly, the heap grew larger and larger until it reached all the way to the top of the wall. Then Ashurbanipal commanded his men to build a siege tower, a wooden tower on wheels. The soldiers pushed the tower up to the ramp towards the city walls. On top of the tower, Assyrian archers fired arrows into the city. A battering ram jutted out to the tower's front. The soldiers pushed it right into the wall, breaking up the brick and stone. Soon a section of the wall tottered and fell. The Assyrian army poured through the gap into the city. Another city had fallen to Ashurbanipal and his army. Ashurbanipal was cruel and ruthless to the cities he conquered. He burned houses, smashed walls, and killed anyone who tried to disobey him. He scattered salt in their fields, poisoning the land so that no crops could grow. He took captured people off to be slaves and never let them go home again. Most cities were too frightened to resist Ashurbanipal for long. They agreed to become part of the Assyrian Empire and to pay part of their money to the Assyrian king. Ashurbanipal became very rich. He ruled the biggest empire that the world had ever seen, but all across Assyria, people hated him. The cities conquered by Ashurbanipal obeyed him because they were afraid, but all the time they hoped that Assyria would soon collapse. "When we finally hear the news of your destruction," one conquered man wrote, "we will clap our hands with joy, and no one will cry over you." The Library of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal, king of all Assyria, stood on his palace walls looking out over the city of Nineveh. He had spent years making Nineveh beautiful. It was his favorite city, and he was the strongest king in the world. He had built himself a magnificent palace full of high, cool rooms, hung with silk and painted with rich colors, royal blue, scarlet, yellow as bright as the sun. The 15 great gates of Nineveh's walls had been decorated with the sculptures of bulls and lions and edged with gold. Carved pictures of Ashurbanipal's conquests lined the walls of Nineveh's greatest buildings. Canals brought water into the city so that all Nineveh's people could drink. And throughout Nineveh, Ashurbanipal had planted gardens of strange and beautiful plants so that his subjects could wander through green grass and admire the trees and flowers from far away. But it isn't enough, Ashurbanipal thought. I have made the city beautiful, but will it last after I am dead? 100 years from now, how will anyone know of my greatness? "Excuse me, sir," a voice interrupted him. He turned to see one of his chief scribes holding a clay tablet. The scribe held the tablet out. Ashurbanipal saw that it was covered with writing. "Have you brought me a new book to read?" he asked. Ashurbanipal's scribes, the men who were in charge of writing down all the events of his reign, knew that he loved to read. They were always on the lookout for new books for him, and in those days, books weren't written on paper. They were carved into clay. "We found you a wonderful book," the chief scribe said. "It's a tale from the court of Hammurabi, the great king who ruled Babylon so long ago. No one has ever read it before. One of your men found it in the ruins of Babylon's old walls and kept it safe until we could bring it here to you." Ashurbanipal glanced down at the tablet. This was indeed a find, a story from the days of a famous king of old. Now he could look forward to a good long evening of reading. That night, Ashurbanipal sat in his room reading his new tablet by lamplight. He had an idea. "How many of these tablets are left in the ruins of old cities?" he said to himself. "If they are not rescued, they will crumble away into dust. Then we'll never know these stories from old times. What if I were to collect them all together and keep them here in my palace? That would be a great project indeed, and then I would become known as the king who collected books, and people could read my books hundreds of years from now." Ashurbanipal set his new idea into action at once. He sent his scribes out into all parts of the vast kingdom of Assyria, ordering them to collect all the tablets they could find and bring them back to Nineveh. He commanded other scribes to go out and ask people of Assyria to repeat the stories they had heard from their grandfathers and grandmothers. These stories had been told to children for centuries, but no one had ever written them down. Ashurbanipal's scribes wrote them down on clay tablets so that they could be kept forever. He ordered the priests of Assyria to write down the words of their prayers. The court astrologers wrote down the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The court doctors wrote down everything they knew about illness and medicine. The court historians recorded all of the details of Ashurbanipal's reign and everything they knew about the kings who had come before him. All of those clay tablets were thick and heavy, so Ashurbanipal built more and more rooms to keep them in. Soon he had collected thousands and thousands of clay tablets full of stories, prayers, instructions, history, science, medicine, and law. He had created the first library in the world. And Ashurbanipal's wish came true. Although many of the tablets were destroyed in Assyria's wars with other countries, some of them still survive today, thousands of years later. They can still be read, and because we have Ashurbanipal's clay tablets, we remember him as the king who collected books, the first librarian ever.